The marketplace of Station Kepler 7 hummed with 1,000 voices, each belonging to a different species from across the galaxy. Merchants hawked their wares beneath flickering hollow signs while travelers negotiated passage to distant worlds. The air itself was a cocktail of smells, exotic spices from the outer rim, ozone from Docking Bay 3, and the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere that every station dweller knew too well. Through it all shuffled Ember, a dragon no larger than a house cat. His scales, once brilliant crimson, had faded to the color of old rust. Each step sent small tremors through his tired frame. His wings hung limp against his sides, torn and useless from centuries of neglect. Around his neck sat a collar of dark metal, etched with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the light, as if they were alive and trying to escape notice. The dragon's golden eyes scanned the crowd with practiced weariness. He'd learned long ago not to hope for much. A meal here. A safe corner there. Perhaps a few hours without being chased away. That was all he dared to wish for anymore. A 4-armed Vrexian merchant stood behind a food stall, arranging colorful fruits that Ember didn't recognize. The smell made his stomach clench with hunger. He approached slowly, careful not to startle anyone. Years of rejection had taught him to be small, to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible. The Vrexian glanced down at him. For a moment, just a brief flicker, there was something like pity in those alien eyes. Then the merchant's gaze fell upon the collar. The change was instant and complete. The Vrexian's face went pale beneath purple skin, and all 4 hands froze mid-motion. No. Move along. The words were clipped, final. Not cruel exactly, but absolutely certain. Ember nodded slowly and continued walking. He didn't argue anymore. What would be the point? The collar spoke louder than any words he could offer. He tried the water station next. A towering Quilix operator, all tentacles and bioluminescent patches, started to offer assistance. The being's natural kindness showed in the way it reached out, ready to help. Then those strange, bulbous eyes spotted the collar. Every tentacle recoiled at once, pulling back as if Ember carried some contagious disease. I cannot serve you. Please leave. Even through the translator, Ember could hear the genuine distress in the creature's voice. Not anger. Fear. Deep, instinctual fear coded into its very DNA. I understand, Ember said softly. He always said that. It was easier than making them feel worse about it. This had been Ember's existence for longer than he cared to remember. 300 years of the same scene playing out in different markets, on different stations, with different faces showing the same recognition and rejection. Every species knew the collar. Every species had been programmed, genetically altered to respond exactly this way. See the collar. Remember the wars. Feel the horror. Look away. Forget. Survive. He couldn't blame them really. They were just doing what their bodies told them to do. Ember's legs trembled as exhaustion finally overtook him. His last meal had been 2 days ago, scraps from a waste recycler that a maintenance bot hadn't noticed him take. His wings, useless as they were, felt like lead weights dragging him down. The constant hum of the station, the press of the crowd, the endless cycle of hope and rejection, it all crashed down on him at once. The old dragon's vision blurred. His legs gave out. He collapsed near a small storefront with a red and white pole spinning lazily outside, its colors hypnotic and oddly comforting. Through fading consciousness, he saw a sign that read Jake's Barber Shop, in standard Galactic and English. How strange, he thought dimly. A human establishment. There weren't many humans this far out yet. They were still new to the galactic community, still finding their place among the stars. The ground was cold against his scales. Ember's breathing grew shallow. Maybe this was it. Maybe he could finally rest. 3 centuries was long enough to carry memories no one else wanted to bear. Long enough to be invisible. Long enough to be alone. As consciousness faded, Ember heard a door chime, the pleasant old-fashioned kind that rang with actual bells. Then footsteps. Quick, purposeful footsteps moving closer. Hey buddy, you alright? The voice was human. Young. Mel. Concerned in a way that sounded genuine, not performative. There was no fear in it, no hesitation. Just simple, direct worry for another living being in distress. Ember tried to open his eyes, to warn the human away before he saw the collar, before the inevitable rejection came. But his body wouldn't cooperate anymore. The darkness was pulling him down, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. The last thing he felt before passing out completely was hands, gentle, careful hands, lifting him up. And the last thing he heard was that same voice, closer now, speaking in that strange Earth accent. Let's get you inside and warmed up. Can't have you dying on my doorstep. Bad for business. There was something almost like humor in those words. Something Ember hadn't heard directed at him in longer than he could remember. Then the darkness took him completely, and for the first time in 300 years, Ember didn't dream of war. Jake Mitchell had been cutting hair on Kepler-7 for 3 years now. He'd left Earth with big dreams of adventure, of exploring strange new worlds and meeting fascinating aliens. What he'd found instead was something better, something more real. A simple, honest living among the stars. A small shop where beings from 100 different worlds sat in his chair and trusted him with something as personal as their appearance. It wasn't the grand adventure he'd imagined, but it felt right. When he saw the small dragon collapsed outside his shop that afternoon, his first instinct was the same as it would have been back in Ohio, the same as it had always been. Help first, ask questions later. He scooped up Ember carefully, surprised by how light the creature was. Too light really. Like picking up a bird with hollow bones. The dragon's scales felt rough and cold under his hands, nothing like the smooth, warm reptiles back on Earth. He brought him inside, shouldering the door open and laying him gently on the waiting area couch. The old leather creaked under the weight even as slight as it was. The dragon's breathing was shallow but steady. That was good. Jake had learned basic first aid for about a dozen different species since opening the shop. Came with the territory when you worked in a place like this. Let's get some water in you, little guy, Jake murmured, heading to his break room. He grabbed a bowl and filled it with clean water from the purifier. His hands moved on autopilot the way they did when he was worried but trying not to show it. When he came back, Ember's eyes had opened. They were golden, bright as new coins, and ancient in a way that made Jake's breath catch. Those eyes had seen things. Lived through things. There was a weariness in them that went deeper than simple exhaustion. The dragon watched him with what looked like weary acceptance. No hope. No expectation. Just the tired patience of someone who'd been through this dance 1,000 times before. Jake held the bowl close and helped him drink. The dragon's tongue was delicate, almost cat-like as he lapped at the water. He drank slowly, carefully, like someone who'd learned not to waste a single drop of anything given to them. It was while Jake was holding the bowl that he noticed the collar properly for the first time. Unlike the sleek tech most species wore, those fancy translator devices and identity chips, this was clearly ancient. Handcrafted by someone who knew what they were doing. The metal was dark, almost black, and the symbols etched into it seemed to shift when he looked at them from different angles. The craftsmanship was incredible. Important. That's some serious metalwork, Jake said, leaning closer. His curiosity was kicking in now, that same itch that had driven him to spend his evenings learning xenolinguistics. Most people thought it was a weird hobby. What did a barber need with ancient alien languages? But Jake enjoyed puzzles. He enjoyed understanding things that others overlooked. The symbols on the collar weren't standard translation matrix code. They weren't even close. They were older. Much older. The kind of script that predated the current Galactic Council by centuries. He grabbed his tablet from the counter and started scanning. The device hummed softly as it captured images of the symbols, running them through historical databases. Jake had built up quite a collection over the years. Dead languages, ceremonial scripts, military designations from wars most people had forgotten. It was amazing what you could find in the public archives if you knew where to look. The first line translated slowly, word by word appearing on his screen. Warden of the Last Fleet. Jake's eyebrows rose. That was a military title. An old one. He kept reading, his heart starting to beat faster. Bearer of Final Witness. Guardian of the Cascade's End. He who remembers so others may forget. Jake's hands began to shake. The tablet nearly slipped from his grip. He looked up at Ember, who was watching him with those tired, knowing eyes. Waiting. Always waiting for the moment when understanding turned to fear, when kindness turned to rejection. You're? Jake's voice came out rough. He cleared his throat and tried again. You were one of them. The ones who fought in the Cascade Wars. Ember's head dipped in the smallest of nods. Even that tiny movement seemed to cost him something. Jake's breath caught in his chest. He'd read about the Cascade Wars in forbidden archives, the kind of files that carried warnings about historical trauma and psychological damage. A conflict so brutal, so absolutely devastating, that the surviving species had collectively agreed to erase it from official history. Entire star systems had been sterilized. Civilizations that had stood for thousands of years had chosen extinction rather than surrender. The death toll had been in the trillions. And this tiny, exhausted dragon had been there. Had witnessed it all. Had carried those memories, those testimonies, for centuries while everyone else was allowed to forget. The weight of it hit Jake like a physical blow. 300 years. 300 years of carrying that burden alone. 300 years of being invisible because the sight of him triggered genetic memories that other species couldn't handle. Jake set down his tablet with trembling hands. The device clattered against the counter, but he barely heard it. His mind was racing, trying to process what he'd just learned. This wasn't just some old soldier. This was a living monument. A breathing archive of the galaxy's darkest chapter. But when Jake looked at Ember, he didn't see a monument. He saw someone who was hungry, exhausted, and alone. Someone who needed help. The question came out before Jake could second-guess himself. When's the last time you had a decent meal? Ember's eyes widened. Those ancient golden eyes went round with surprise, and for just a moment the weariness lifted. Of all the reactions he'd expected, fear, disgust, pity, rejection, this wasn't one of them. Not even close. Over the next few days, Jake closed his barber shop early. The regulars noticed, of course. A few aliens asked if everything was all right, and Jake just smiled and said he had something important to take care of. Which was true. He brought Ember into his small apartment above the shop, carried him up the narrow stairs with the kind of care you'd show a fragile antique. The apartment wasn't much, just a bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, and a living space with a worn couch and a window that looked out over the station's commercial district. Jake set up a comfortable bed in the corner using spare blankets and an old heating pad he'd brought from Earth. Dragons were reptilian, he figured. They probably liked warmth. He cooked simple meals, nothing fancy. Rice and vegetables mostly, some protein substitutes from the station market. Basic stuff that wouldn't upset an empty stomach. At first, Ember barely ate. He'd take a few bites, then stop, watching Jake with those ancient eyes like he was waiting for something. Waiting for the trap to spring. Waiting for the kindness to evaporate like it always did. But Jake kept showing up. Morning, noon, and night. He'd sit on the floor next to Ember's bed, eating his own meals there, talking about nothing important. The weather systems on the station. A funny customer he'd had last week. How much he missed real Earth coffee. After 3 days of this, Jake started asking simple questions. Not about wars or battles. Just normal things. Did you always live on stations, or were there dragon homeworlds? Ember had looked startled by the question, like no one had asked him anything personal in years. Which Jake realized was probably exactly the case. There were homeworlds, Ember said quietly. 7 of them once. What were they like? The dragon's eyes got a distant look. Warm. Mountains that touched the clouds. Caves that went down for miles, lit by crystal formations we'd grown ourselves over generations. Jake noticed Ember had said were not are. He didn't push it. What did you do before? Everything? Jake asked another evening after they'd finished dinner. Slowly, like ice melting in spring, Ember began to speak. His voice was raspy from disuse, scratchy like old vinyl records, but it carried weight. Real weight. The kind that came from lived experience, from centuries of stories locked away inside. There were gardens, Ember said one evening, staring at nothing in particular. His gaze was fixed on the window, but Jake got the feeling he was seeing something else entirely. Somewhere else. Someone else. On Valtar Prime. I tended flame lilies. They only bloomed under starlight, never under suns. Delicate things. Temperamental. You had to sing to them. Sing to them? Jake asked, genuinely curious. Dragons have always been singers, Ember said, and there was something almost like pride in his voice. Before we were warriors, we were gardeners and singers and makers of beautiful things. Jake listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't push for war stories or tactical information or any of the heavy stuff. He just let Ember talk about flowers and songs and the life he'd lived before everything went wrong. I wrote poetry, Ember continued one night, and there was surprise in his own voice as if he'd forgotten this part of himself completely. Terrible poetry. My clutchmates would mock me mercilessly. Said I had the soul of a poet but the skill of a hatchling. Jake grinned. Tell me one. Ember hesitated, then began to recite. It was about the first time he'd seen a nebula birth new stars, watching from the observation deck of a colony ship. The metaphors were clumsy, the rhythm was off, and some of the rhymes didn't quite work even in translation. It was, as promised, not very good. Jake laughed anyway. Not mocking but genuine and warm. Hey, that's better than anything I could write. I can barely manage a birthday card. After a moment, Ember laughed too. It was a sound like crackling embers, like a fire just catching hold, rusty and unpracticed but real. It was possibly the most beautiful sound Jake had ever heard. They fell into a comfortable routine after that. Jake would work during the day, come up during lunch to check on Ember, then spend his evenings just talking. About everything and nothing. About Earth and lost dragon worlds. About bad poetry and good memories. On the 5th day, Jake finally asked about the collar. The change in Ember was immediate. The good humor drained from his face like water through a sieve. His small body tensed, and those golden eyes went flat and distant again. I am a living record, he said quietly, each word careful and measured. When the Cascade Wars ended, someone had to remember. To carry the testimony of those who fell. To ensure the horrors couldn't be repeated without witness. Without someone who remembered why they should never happen again. Jake leaned forward, elbows on his knees. And everyone else just forgot? They chose to forget. The survivors, the governments, the species councils, they all agreed. They altered genetic memory codes, edited historical databases, made it so that seeing me would trigger ancient trauma responses. Ember's claws scraped against the floor, leaving tiny marks in the old wood. See me, remember the wars. Remember the wars, remember the pain. It was easier to edit me out of existence than to deal with what I represented. I have been invisible for 300 years. Jake sat back processing this. His jaw was tight, and when he spoke, his voice was flat and hard. That's the most messed up thing I've ever heard. Ember blinked, startled. You're not afraid? Disgusted. Why would I be? Jake's voice rose slightly, anger creeping in. Not at Ember. At the situation. At a galaxy that could do this to someone. You didn't start the wars. You ended them. You volunteered to carry all that weight so everyone else could heal and move on with their lives. You gave up everything, your home, your privacy, your chance at a normal life so billions of others wouldn't have to suffer. Jake shook his head, running a hand through his hair. Where I come from, we call people like you heroes. We build monuments to people who sacrifice themselves for others. We tell stories about them. We make damn sure they're never forgotten. Ember stared at him. Those ancient golden eyes went wide, and something broke behind them. Some wall that had been holding back an ocean for 3 centuries finally cracked. Then, for the first time in 300 years, the old dragon wept. Word spread through the human community on Kepler 7. It started the way these things usually do, with one person telling another over drinks or during a work shift. Jake told his friend Brett, who worked at the docking authority managing incoming cargo ships. Brett was the kind of guy who couldn't keep a good story to himself even if he tried. Brett told his sister Lisa, who ran a small restaurant 3 levels down from Jake's shop. The kind of place that served real food, not the synthetic stuff most stations pushed. Lisa told her partner Chris, who managed the hydroponics bay where half the station's fresh vegetables came from. Within a week, Jake's apartment had regular visitors. He'd come home from work to find people waiting in the hallway, holding packages and looking a bit sheepish about showing up unannounced. Brett was the first. He came by on a Tuesday evening with a box full of old Earth movies on data chips. Physical media, the kind you couldn't get anymore unless you knew someone who knew someone. Figured you might enjoy some stories from our homeworld, Brett said, handing the box to Ember. This one's about a samurai. You know, honor, duty, that kind of thing. Thought it might be up your alley. Ember had just stared at the box like it might bite him. I don't understand. Why would you give me this? Because Jake said you liked stories, Brett said simply, shrugging like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And because samurai movies are awesome. End of story. Lisa arrived the next day with containers of food stacked in an insulated carrier. The smell alone made Jake's mouth water. Real spices, real cooking, not the reheated stuff he usually managed. I adapted some recipes to match what Jake said you liked, she explained, setting everything out on Jake's small kitchen counter. Might not be exact but worth a try. There's a stew here with root vegetables, some kind of grain pilaf thing, and I made this dessert with honey and nuts. Jake mentioned dragons have a sweet tooth. Ember had looked overwhelmed. This is too much. I cannot possibly. Just eat what you want, Lisa interrupted gently. The rest keeps. No pressure. Chris came with something different. He showed up on Thursday with a small potted plant in a crystalline container, the kind used in hydroponics to maintain perfect growing conditions. The plant inside was small, with thick leaves that shimmered slightly under the apartment's lights. Jake mentioned you liked gardening, Chris said, setting it down carefully near the window. Thought you might want to try growing something again. It's a modified earth succulent, tweaked to survive station atmosphere. Pretty hardy. Difficult to kill even if you try. Ember stared at the plant. His claws trembled as he reached out and touched the soil, running his fingers through the dark earth like it was something precious. Something holy. I have nothing to offer you, Ember said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. No money. No knowledge you'd want. No services I can provide. Why do you do this? Chris exchanged glances with Brett and Lisa. They all looked a bit uncomfortable, like they were trying to explain something that didn't need explanation. Because you're here, Chris said finally. Because you need help. Because... He struggled for words, running a hand through his hair. Because it's the right thing to do. Lisa knelt down to Ember's level, her knees popping slightly as she did. She was in her 40s, with laugh lines around her eyes and calloused hands from years of kitchen work. My grandmother was a nurse in the Pacific Theater, she said softly. Back during one of our old wars. World War II. She saw awful things. Things that stayed with her for the rest of her life. When she came home, some people wanted her to forget, to never talk about it. To just move on and pretend it never happened. Lisa's voice got quieter. But some of us, we sat with her. We listened. Not because we wanted the gory details or the tactical breakdowns. But because she needed someone to know she'd been there. That what she went through mattered. That she mattered. Ember's golden eyes were fixed on her face. Your species honors its witnesses. We try to, Jake said from where he stood by the kitchen. Doesn't always work out. We mess it up plenty. But yeah, we try. Over the following weeks, more humans came. Word had gotten around properly now, and Jake's apartment became a gathering place. People would stop by after their shifts, bringing small gifts or just sitting and talking. They didn't ask about battles or casualties or tactical decisions. They didn't want Ember to relive his trauma for their entertainment. Instead, they asked what his favorite color was. Whether dragons had music, and if so, what it sounded like. If he'd ever seen Earth's moon, or what he thought about human coffee. Normal questions. The kind you'd ask any new friend. The other species on the station noticed. How could they not? Vrexian traders would walk past Jake's shop and see through the windows, humans sitting on the floor, laughing at something, while an ancient dragon gestured with his small claws as he told a story. Quillick's information brokers, who made their living knowing everything about everyone, couldn't understand it. Humans showed no fear. No genetic imperative to look away. No programmed revulsion. One Vrexian finally approached Jake outside his shop one evening. The alien's 4 arms were crossed in a gesture that translated roughly to concerned confusion. You don't understand what he is, the Vrexian said, his translator rendering his voice as deeply worried. What he represents. The collar? I understand exactly what he is, Jake replied, his voice calm but firm. He met the alien's eyes without flinching. A person who's been alone for way too long. And that ends now. The Vrexian stared at him, then shook his head slowly and walked away. But Jake noticed something. The next day, that same Vrexian left a small package outside his shop. Inside was a heat lamp, the expensive kind used for reptilian species. There was no note. 2 months after Jake found him, Ember grew weaker. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden crisis. Just a gradual fading, like a candle burning down to its last bit of wick. He slept more. Ate less. His breathing became labored even when he was resting. The humans knew what was coming. They'd all seen death before in one form or another. You didn't make it to a frontier station like Kepler-7 without losing someone along the way. Jake moved a cot into his apartment to stay close. He'd wake up several times each night just to check that Ember was still breathing, still there. Brett started coming by every evening after his shift, sitting quietly in the corner. Lisa brought soup that was easy to swallow. Chris tended to the plant he'd given Ember, making sure it stayed healthy and green. On the final night, they all knew. There was something in the air, that heavy feeling that comes before a storm. Ember's breathing grew shallow, each breath a visible effort. His golden eyes, once so bright and ancient, had dimmed to the color of old coins. Around him sat Jake, Brett, Lisa, Chris, and a dozen other humans who'd come to know the old dragon over the past 2 months. They'd all dropped everything to be there. Called in favors at work. Rearranged their lives. Because this mattered. Because he mattered. I thought I would die alone, Ember whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the station's life support systems. Forgotten. Just another piece of history no one wanted to remember. Not a chance, Jake said, gripping one small claw gently between his fingers. The scales were cool to the touch now, growing colder. You've got a whole room full of people here who'd argue with that. Ember's eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in each face. Memorizing them, maybe. Or maybe just grateful to see them one last time. Tell me about Earth. One more time. So they did. Jake started talking about the oceans he'd grown up near in Ohio. The Great Lakes, huge and blue and alive. Brett described the mountains he'd hiked in Colorado, peaks so high they scraped the sky. Lisa talked about the cities that never slept, places like New York and Tokyo where millions of lives intersected every single day. Chris spoke about the plains, stretches of grassland that went on forever, where you could see the curve of the planet if you looked hard enough. They talked about humanity's endless, stubborn refusal to give up on each other. About how humans would cross oceans to save a single person. How they'd dig through rubble for days looking for survivors. How they'd give their last meal to a stranger if that stranger was hungry. "We're not perfect," Jake added softly. "We mess up. We fight. We hurt each other sometimes. But when it counts, when someone really needs help, we show up. That's just what we do." Ember closed his eyes, and a faint smile crossed his scaled face. It was peaceful, that smile. "Content. Your species will do remarkable things," he whispered, each word taking effort now. "Remember that. When the galaxy tests you, and it will test you, remember you chose kindness, when it cost you nothing, and everything." He took one final breath, deep and slow. Then he was gone. The humans sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the station's ventilation system, that constant background hum that everyone stopped noticing after a while. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there with their friend, not quite ready to let go. Then one by one they wept. Not for a legend or a monument or a piece of galactic history. But for a friend they'd known for too brief a time. For an old dragon who liked poetry and gardening and stories about Earth. Jake arranged a funeral. He could have done it quietly, tucked away in some forgotten corner of the station where no one would notice. That would have been easier. Safer maybe. But that wasn't right. That wasn't what Ember deserved. He held it in the station's memorial garden, a small green space on level 12 where people went to remember their dead. He invited everyone, alien and human alike. Sent out notices on every communication channel. Made it public and open and impossible to ignore. Most aliens stayed away at first. The genetic programming was still strong. See the collar, feel the fear, look away. But curiosity is a powerful thing. It drew them eventually, in ones and twos. The collar was displayed in a transparent case that Chris had helped design, climate-controlled and protected. The full translation was provided in every major language, dozens of alien scripts flowing across small displays around the case. Jake had added a plaque made from brushed steel. "Here lies Ember, warden of the last fleet. He carried our darkest memories so we could heal. He asked nothing but to be seen. May we never forget those who remember for us." Beneath it, in a smaller inscription, Jake had added, "Tended by Jake Mitchell and the humans of Kepler 7 who chose to see." The plant Chris had given Ember was there too, now flourishing in the garden's controlled environment. It had grown larger, healthier, and recently it had bloomed. The flowers were a deep crimson, the exact color of Ember's scales in his youth, back before centuries of burden had dulled them to rust. Slowly, other species began to visit. At first it was just curiosity, that need to see what the humans were making such a fuss about. But then something shifted. Older aliens, those whose genetic coding wasn't as strong, began to remember fragments. Pieces of stories their ancestors had buried. They brought their own memorials, their own flowers, their own plaques. The memorial garden grew. Jake continued cutting hair. Life went on the way it always does. But his shop became something more than just a place to get a trim. People came to remember, to witness, to honor. They'd sit in his waiting area and look at the small painting that Lisa had commissioned from a local artist. It showed a tiny dragon, scales bright and crimson, wings whole and strong, tending a garden beneath alien stars. The flowers were flame lilies, blooming under starlight. Beneath it, Jake had written in his own hand with a permanent marker, "Nobody gets left behind. Nobody gets forgotten." That's the human way. The galaxy was learning what that meant. And it was changing them.